2021 is finally dead, which is great to hear. So, my plan for today is to talk about the best books that I read in 2021. You get the premise. These are in no particular order because I'm too indecisive to do any shit like that. Props to people who do. The first book I want to talk about today is The Invisible Life of Addy LaRue by V.E. Schwab. This book follows a girl who made a deal with the devil to get out of an arranged marriage. Essentially, she can live forever, but she is forgotten by everyone that she meets. I don't think that, arguably this is the best book on the list, just, objectively is the word I meant to use. But the thing for me is that I really love V.E. Schwab. I really love her writing. It just kind of feels cozy, home to me to crack open a V.E. Schwab book. I also really like this book because the main character is very lonely, she's forgotten by everyone she meets. Of course she's fucking lonely. But I read this during the pandemic when I was also very lonely, so it felt even more like a friend then, which is kind of a sad thing to say. But just in general, I knew as soon as I read this one that I was gonna love it, and I did. So it's on my best list. I like that I'm pretending to be a game show host. Yes, this book. I don't know, I'm gonna put it. That could be way off. Next, I want to talk about Know My Name by Chanel Miller. This is a memoir written by Chanel Miller, whose story of sexual assault went viral. She was Brock Turner's victim. If you don't know the story, it's fucking rough, so be warned before you look it up. But this book essentially follows her story from the night before the assault happened to after. It takes you through the trial, but it also takes you through really heart-wrenching moments, like her waking up in the hospital, not sure why she's there. No one's explaining that they found her passed out unconscious behind a dumpster where a boy was assaulting her. This book really spoke to me. I got very mad at everything while reading it just because I was mad at the injustice of the world. I cried a lot. It was very touching. Chanel Miller is a great writer, which honestly isn't always expected in memoirs, especially for something like this, but it was beautiful, honestly. It also touched me specifically as a law student because it just showed how fucking terrible it is for victims to go through trial and how much the system needs to change. I think that this is honestly a must read. I think it could teach people a lot about what fucking victims of sexual assault have to go through. I'm getting heated just talking about it. Definitely a favorite of the year. Next, I want to sprinkle in a nonfiction book that I read, and that is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. I've talked a lot about this book, I feel like I talk about it to everyone, so I think I've mentioned it here. Essentially, this book talks about how the American government played a huge role in segregating America residentially. Well, also obviously, actually segregating, but it talks specifically about residential segregation. This book is so comprehensive. I said in my 2021 wrap-up that this book makes the best case reparations I've ever seen, and it's true. I think about this book all the time. I talk about it to everyone. I love the way that Rothstein comprehensively shows how Black Americans have been left out of every major wealth acquiring moment in America. Specifically, we talk about and idolize things like the New Deal, but in the New Deal, Black people were left out of those opportunities that white Americans were freely given. I think this book's really important. I think it's something that every American should read. I can't get over it. I've discussed this book in depth with my father, who is right-leaning, and they've even held sway over him. He's been impressed by the arguments this book makes. So I think that's really a mark in its favor. Definitely recommend, as I do all of these books, because they're the best of 2021. Then I just want to knock out two right off the bat, because if you've ever heard me speak, you've heard me speak about these two novels, and that is Her Body and Other Parties, little picture here, and then also In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. Fucking hell. Jesus Christ. I read Her Body and Other Parties first, so let's just talk about that. That book is a collection of short stories. It's kind of just about the terror of being a woman in modern day society. It also talks about queerness, and they're just a bunch of short horror stories. Those had a real impact on me because I don't like short stories. It's always been something that I struggle to read, but I love that collection, and it really made me excited to pick up more of this author's works. So of course I had to pick up In the Dream House, which is Machado's memoir of her experience being in an abusive queer relationship. This book blew me away. I love both of them equally, although I think this one could have a leg up. I just really fell in love with Machado's writing style this year. I cannot wait to see what else she publishes, and honestly, she's now my favorite writer in the entire world. Favorite shit I've ever read. She's incredible and so clever, Oh, I'm obsessed. Next, another nonfiction. I'm trying to like sprinkle them in alongst the fiction because I know people are less interested in them, and that's fine. But the next book is 1491, New Revelations of Americas Before Columbus by Charles Mann. I bought this book years ago, and it took me a long time to read it, but I was really glad that I did. First of all, I want to say right away, it's written so excessively. I know a lot of nonfiction can be kind of off-putting for a lot of people because a lot of times it's written really poorly and that makes it boring. This book, though, is written in a very engaging way. It talks about like the stereotypes that a lot of Americans have, well, not just Americans, a lot of people have about Native Americans. It specifically tackles the ideas that they were lacking in technology, that their populations weren't large before Europeans colonized. And also the idea, like the very racist stereotype that they didn't have any effect on nature. It goes into these things like very deeply, and it honestly blew my mind. It changed my way that I think about a lot of these issues, specifically the idea of like technological advancement and how different cultures are advanced in different ways, and that's often suited to their environment and where they're living and what resources they have. This book was so incredible. This is another one that I think all Americans should read. So good. Can't recommend enough. Then to move in some more fiction, Exit West by Majan Hamid. This book, like, I kind of hesitated to put it on my favorites list because I don't think I was as emotionally attached to it, but I do think it's such a crazy cool, really amazing book. So this book follows two people whose names I forget. They're starting a relationship as their country becomes torn apart from war. And then at the same time as this like refugee crisis, global refugee crisis, mysterious portals start popping up all across the world, and essentially refugees start using them to escape their countries and go to wealthier Western countries. This book's so cool. It's really incredible. I love the commentary within it, so that really boosted it up on the list for me. Then we have The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. This one is like honestly a bitch to describe. It's a high fantasy, fucking huge. There's so much that goes on into it. High fantasies in general are very hard to describe. What I will say, there are dragons. There's a lot of political intrigue, and I really loved this book. First of all, the plot was amazing. I was very engaged, but also I really loved that it was female-centric. It made me realize while reading it how rare it is to get female-centered high adult fantasy specifically. A lot of the female-centered fantasy that we read nowadays is YA, and this just like made it glaringly obvious the gaps that we have in adult fiction. This book was also more diverse, and there were also like queer characters as well, which again is another thing that high fantasy is typically lacking in. It was so good. I really hope that Samantha Shannon continues to put out these female-centered high fantasies, because I want more. If you have any recommendations, please let me know. I'm dying for it. Next is the last nonfiction on this list, and that is Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation by Sylvia Federici. This book, okay, like all the nonfiction on this list is good. All these books are good, but this book blew my mind. This book is essentially a history of the body, and specifically the female body, and the transition to capitalism. It talks about the peasant revolts of the Middle Ages, and then also the witch hunts, and honestly, I feel like I can't even succinctly describe what this book is about, because there's just so many different aspects of it. Something that really stuck with me is the way that we portray the Middle Ages as like highly patriarchal, and yes, it was, but I really enjoyed Federici diving into the ways that women had power, and obviously not the same power as men of the era, but there were still ways that women had independence and power during the Middle Ages in ways that we've been completely stripped of to this day, and that we were completely stripped of for centuries. It also talks about the witch hunts as a form of state terror against women, and specifically women who are challenging capitalism and the patriarchy. I think this book is amazing. For the rest of my life, I'm never going to get over this book, and it's one that I actually see myself returning to in the near future. We've got 2 more books left. First of which is Frankenstein in Baghdad by Ahmed Sadawi. This is another book similar to Exit West, where I wasn't as emotionally attached to it as I was to these other books that I've been talking about, but this book is so mind-blowing. This book is so cool. It takes place in US-occupied Baghdad. One of the main characters essentially collects human body parts that are just left in the street from like the war-torn streets and the fighting, and he sews them together to create a person as like a commentary on the situation. But then the next day the body is gone, and at the same time the corpse goes missing, all of a sudden people start being killed by this mysterious figure all across the city. It's insane. Like, that's so cool. And that's honestly why I had to boost it up into this list, because I think this is a book a lot more people should read. I think this is a brilliant novel, and I would love to read more about this author. I'm not sure if he has anything else, but if he does, I'd love to read it. And then lastly, this is not the last book. This is a stand-in, because it's the closest thing I have to it. The last book is Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. This is just the sequel. It's the only one I have right now. So Parable of the Sower is a climate change inspired sci-fi story. It follows main character Lauren, who is living in America, but like post intense climate change. There's a drought, water is a very scarce resource, there's fighting in the streets, and the American government obviously isn't doing anything to protect people. And in the midst of all this chaos, Lauren is creating a new religion, which is also super interesting. This book, first of all, is incredibly topical. We need to do something about climate change, and it will give you a lot of climate anxiety. Not gonna lie, I was dealing with, when it rained when I was reading this book, I was like, oh my god, there's water, thank god. This book though was also so creative. I really loved the aspects of religion, which I was kind of surprised about. I thought I might be hesitant, but I thought it was really interesting. But yeah, this novel is also just brilliant, and one that I can't stop thinking about. Very excited to read the sequel. And there you have it. Those are the best books that I read in 2021. I'm in love with all of these books. Thank you for listening to me rant about them. Goodbye.